What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my video tutorial on how to paint Darth Maul for Atomic Mass Games' Shatterpoint. I've got the colors I've used up on the screen now, so if you want to give the video a pause, you copy those down, and then we can dive right on in. So I'm going to start with a base coat of Tenebrous Gray over all of the brown fatigues, to add a bit of color, and then the Tenebrous Gray has a bit of a purple tone, which is great for shadows. From there, I'll do a 50-50 mix of Tenebrous Gray and brown leather, and I'll start to highlight the fatigues, leaving the Tenebrous Gray in the deepest shadows and recesses of any creases and folds. I'll continue highlighting up with pure leather brown, and you can see here that I'm starting to fade or I'm glazing down my highlights. So blocking them in where they're fairly strong, and then fading them out into my mid and shadow tones. My final highlight is a mix of leather brown and modern gray. Once again, focusing on those highlights and feathering down. I keep some of my leather brown and Tenebrous Gray on the palette so I can tweak and modulate some of my mid and shadow tones and sort of wet blend the colors together. From there, I'll start with a base coat of rubber black and highlight up into ash gray for the neutral gray sort of robes. Very similar to the brown fatigues, I'm going to start with a base coat of that rubber black and then just glaze up into my mid and bright tone grays. To paint the non-metal silver, I'll start with a base coat of very dark brown. In particular, on the belt, you want to be very careful to leave a lot of the black lining in the recesses. The neater here you are, the easier it will be in the cleanup phase. From there, I'll start to highlight with leather brown. And when I'm working up through the silver, this is more or less progressive highlighting, working through these various colors up into my mid and highlight tones. As I get brighter and brighter, I'm going to start to focus in on some of those edge highlights. And then in the mid-tone, especially when I get between the modern gray and the warm gray, I'll want to make sure I have a nice sharp edge highlight over all of the edges. For an area like the belt, you want to make sure that you're applying your highlights over the entire belt as if it were one surface so that your highlights carry consistently through. What this means is that on the belt, it'll be more or less brighter on the top, getting towards the midtones in the middle of the area, and then the bottom row of the belt will probably be deeper in that shadow tone. Here you can see that my Dunkelgelb is more or less that mid-tone range of the silver, and so I'm making sure to apply an edge highlight over the top and bottom edges. With the warm gray, I'm going to start to focus on the top half of the belt, and then on the individual segments of the belt, the top and sides of the edges, leaving the underside unhighlighted. And then finally, Pale Sands is my final highlight, so focusing on the top edges, corners, and ridges. I avoided taking the non-metal on this figure up to pure white, just because there's so little of it on the model. I didn't want it to draw attention away from what would be the brightest part of the model, which is the white highlighting on the lightsaber. To paint the blue-black armor, I'm going to start with a base coat of dark sea blue. And then from there, I'm going to apply a highlight with anthracite gray. I'm treating this blue-black armor as a more reflective surface, and so rather than apply a simple gradient, I'm incorporating some non-metal highlighting approach, adding some bands of highlights and making sure that I have some strong mid and dark tone highlighting shadows on both halves of the shoulder pad. So here my final highlight is from anthracite blue into that gray blue, and you can really see on the shoulder pad how I have that edge highlight running around the edge of the shoulder pad, and then a stronger band highlighting running down the center with my deep contrast, my shadow tones on either side. Having that shift from that bright edge highlight immediately beside a dark shadow tone into a brighter highlighting band helps to sell that reflection. I'll finish off with some glazes of black just to reinforce some of those shadow tones. Using some burnt red, I'm going to block in the red elements of the figure. This means base coating the lightsaber blades, as well as the red tattoos on the face and the torso. I tried being neat at this stage, but as I highlighted up the red, I just got messier and messier, and decided I'd clean up the black tattoos afterwards. To highlight the tattoos, I'm going to use some brick red, and you can see here that I'm just starting to forget about the black tattooing area, and I'm just focusing on highlighting up the red elements. I'll continue highlighting up with blood red. I wanted to have a rich red-orange tone, and so I think blood red is a very nice mid-tone to work off of. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to the individual facial features and muscles of the face here. And then from blood red, I'll start to mix in progressive amounts of highlight flesh to make my highlighting. You'll want to be careful here not to go too overboard. Too much highlight flesh brings the flesh tone too much into a pink. If you do find that it becomes a little bit too pastel, go back in with glazes of blood red to resaturate the color. With Tenebrous Gray, I'll base coat all of the black tattoos and clean up all of the edges, taking care not to overpaint into the red. To highlight, I'll start to mix some dark sea blue into the highlighting. Again, being very careful not to paint into the red. And the goal here is to bring some of that blue from the armor into the tattoos. With that blue mix, I'm going to start to add some highlighting flesh to create my highlights. This will also help to create a similar highlight tone that we have from the red tattoos. Using an off-white, I'm going to paint the pupils of the eyes. I'm using a 000 brush for this and a very diluted paint mix. From there, I'll use some deep orange and I'll very carefully paint the pupils. And I wasn't able to capture it on the camera, but once I got the orange of the pupils in, I go back in with my off-white and I just add a specular highlight in the center of the eyeball. With leather brown, I'm going to base coat the horns, getting all the way down to the roots and being careful not to overpaint onto the black. I'll highlight this with tan earth, and I'm just pulling and fading the color up to the tips, and I'll follow up with a final highlight of a mix of tan earth and decomposed flesh. I take the horns on the front of the head a little bit brighter, and then not quite as bright on the back part of the head. To paint the lightsaber, I'm going to start with a blend of carmine and blood red, taking the brightest highlights from the tip of the blade and fading it into the base of the lightsaber hilt. From there, I'll mix some white into my blood red, and I'll just apply a bit of a pastel highlight at the very tip of the lightsaber blade. To block in the OSL, I'm going to use some wine red in the airbrush, and I'm just going to very lightly glaze in, sort of just mapping out where the OSL is going to be, being very careful not to overspray too much into the rest of the model. From there, I'm using a variety of red tones to start to block in the source lighting, and basically I'm highlighting with red, thinking about where the lightsaber would create these reflections. I then just extrapolate and create highlighting on the figure using the lightsabers as the light source. The closer it is to the lightsaber blade, the brighter the highlights will be, and as it gets further up the arm, I sort of fade the highlights out. This is a fairly experimental process. I don't really have a fixed mix or a ratio. I'm more just eyeballing where I want some brighter red tones or some darker red tones. As I get into the highlights on the lightsaber, I start to mix some sunny skin tone to create that sort of red yellow or red peachy highlighting. I think this is probably the most frustrating part of the model for me, largely because of where the mold lines were on the figure. I ended up destroying a lot of detailing as I was cleaning it off and having to then go back in and freehand a lot of those ridges on the lightsaber handle. Here I take my highlights even further with the highlight flesh focusing on the ridges closest to the actual hilt of the blade. Once I'm happy with the highlighting, I'll go back in with Vallejo's Evil Red, and pretty much where I have the OSL, I'm going to glaze this into the shadow tones. I find this adds a very nice richness to the shadows, and it helps to warm up and contrast where I have that source lighting. Finally, with pure white, I'm going to highlight the lightsaber blades, and while the blades are cylindrical, I'm going to be treating them as a square or as a rectangle, and I want to put 4 edge highlights on the quote-unquote corners of the blade. And basically this will help to create a couple of great shots or great angles to view the blade where you'll have 1 or 2 white highlights contrasted with the red blend of the blade. And that will complete the Darth Maul figure. If you want to learn how I do the basis for my Shatterpoint collection, I'll have a link in the description below. Because this is a gaming piece, I apply a matte varnish to protect the figure from handling during gameplay. And for this, I'm using Mr. Hobby's Super Clear. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll have links in the description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.